think skill learning, how it's commonly understood, is not how skill learning actually happens in the best way possible.
Hey everyone, I'm very excited to bring you Aaron Martin in this episode, who is an acrobatics coach and who's teaching acrobatics to adults. Aaron has a lot of interesting things to say about learning, not just for acrobatics, but for everyone. So even if you're completely uninterested in acrobatics, this episode will be very interesting for you. And I know that many of my listeners are interested in acrobatics, so for you it will be double interesting. There's one quick thing that I want to say, because I had a minor, let's say, problem in my recording, which is very simply that I didn't plug my microphone in. So when you watch the video, you see a microphone in front of me for the whole time in the interview, but it's actually not plugged in. What you actually hear is the recording directly from the camera. And I'm so happy that my camera has sort of okay microphones, inbuilt microphones, because otherwise this would have been a disaster. I tried to tweak it a little bit, the audio, but it's not like usually from my side, but no problem anyway, because I'm not talking that much. It's mainly Aaron speaking here in this episode. So without any further ado, let's start the episode. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Lebenspraxis Podcast. And today you have the double Germanness here, because there is Aaron Martin here as my guest today in this podcast episode. And we will talk about training, we will talk about soft acrobatics, we will talk about how to train such disciplines that involve more fear for some people, and also what is the bigger picture of a topic like soft acrobatics. And the reason why I invited Aaron is because I was very impressed from what I saw on his Instagram, because I saw this looks like it's very well taken apart, in the sense of that this makes it teachable to adults, because in the topic of acrobatics, it is always a big question: is it possible to teach that well to adults? And if yes, how? Because it's something completely different when you take a child or when you take a teenager to someone that is 30 years old or 40 years old and so on. So this I saw happening in Aaron's work, and this is why I got very excited to talk with him about this topic. And I want to say another thing, which is I wrote to Aaron a message, and then Aaron replied with a voice memo, and I was actually so impressed by this voice message that you sent me, Aaron, that I played it to Annika, because I told her, do you listen to this? This is like a radio, like listening to the radio. It was so well pronounced and really perfectly done, because I receive a lot of audio messages, because I'm sending a lot of audio messages to people. So there's a lot of back and forth with the people that I coach or with friends. And this message that you sent me was really sticking out. So then I thought, wow, this is like even more assuring for me that I want to talk with you, because it sounded to me like you can think, or you can make things clearly in your head. Like it, sometimes these voice messages, they are a bit like all over the place, and they sound a little bit like people are just in the process of making their own thoughts. And this voice message showed me, the thoughts already happened, and now you just bring them out. So my first question, Aaron, is, because I think many people that are listening, maybe they have no idea what soft acrobatics is. So can we first define that? What is soft acrobatics? What is that?
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for the general, kind and generous intro. For soft acro, I have something like a definition. I would call it a working definition. That is, It's a floor-based, non-equipment acrobatic practice with a focus on soft execution and longevity. That is a bit of a mouthful, so I would just more colloquially say what it's about for me and for my students. Essentially, they're really cool acrobatic moves that we all see on social media. Usually, they come out of really unique disciplines, something like gymnastics or capoeira or dance for that sake. And you can sort of tell someone has been putting a decade of movement into whatever they're doing. And there's the desire that I have to learn these same skills. Now, for me, soft acrobatics is just a term that I use to say I have the freedom to take all the best learning strategies from all of these acrobatic disciplines so that I can learn it softly. I don't have to have the harsh landings. I don't have to face plant. I don't have to do the b-boy or breaking thing where it's like, how do I learn it? Just do it more often. Or the parkour thing of like, all right, just in German, we say Augen zu und durch, close your eyes and go for it. I didn't want any of that because in my experience, me as a soccer player, 5 to 15 years old, that just didn't work. So I wanted to find a better way of learning how to learn and how to teach acrobatics. The result is soft acrobat. Also, big disclaimer, it's not my invention at all. There's a bunch of teachers all around the globe who call what they're doing soft acro. And the beautiful thing in that is that the vocabulary is not set, is not fixed, it's not refined. It's not like in gymnastics, you know exactly what a cartwheel is supposed to look like. Because eventually a cartwheel gets me to a round off. It's sort of a force generating and a rotation generating movement. It has a clear defined purpose. In soft acro, I can make my cartwheels look exactly how I want them to look like. And that could be slow, it could be elegant, it could be fast, it could be with bent legs, it could be part of a sequence, it could be with one arm. It's in a way of saying soft acro is a way of approaching acrobatics, and we have the new freedom because there's no tradition in it. It's just a relatively recent phenomenon that people call what they do soft acrobatics, that we now can choose all the best methods that we want to use so that soft acro learning or acrobatic learning can be safe. That was also a mouthful, but I hope a little bit gives a little bit more context.
And from which disciplines are movements or ideas taken?
That's actually a helpful thing I could have said right away. The broad scope, you can think of gymnastics are part of it. Breakdancing is part of it, or breaking or b-boying like the people in the scene like to call it. Contemporary dance has amazing floor and rolling elements that, for example, you won't find in capoeira. Capoeira has beautiful cartwheeling and arching acrobatics that are also in there. But then you're inspired by recent circus artists. Like one of my biggest inspirations is Louis West. I had the chance to learn from him online for the great sake of the internet, making things like this happen. But he was just someone who first did some breaking and then had a tumbling coach and then decided that he wanted to become a circus artist, inventing his own style. So I would say the spirit of invention is almost innate in soft acro. And it's confined by saying, well, now that I'm an adult, I'm not a 5-year-old circus boy orphan. It's constrained by I am in my adult body. So what are realistic things I can pick up in a way that is joyful? That's important to me.
So is this soft acrobatics something you think that can be done to a certain age? Is there an age maximum? What about that? Because acrobatics always has the notion of impact. And if I understand correctly, how you also approach it is because you said in the learning process, it's about not basically falling on your nose and on your head and so on. But do I understand correctly that this is also about low impact movements so that you can do them for a long time?
Exactly. I think it's helpful if I give a bit of my own background of how I found to the practice. For me, I started with parkour at 16 years old. No acrobatic experience. I thought backflips were for circus performers and for Jackie Chan, one of my biggest role models growing up as a kid. And I'm like, this is impossible, but amazing. Then I figured out, well, there are other teenagers who also literally just starting to teach themselves through YouTube. I started in 2009. So YouTube was like 3 or 4 years old and slowly coming. There's these online tutorials. And essentially I just figured out, acrobatics is possible. That's awesome. I was super engulfed in the practice of parkour. On the weekends, we'd meet Saturday and Sunday, go out and train for 5-6 hours, but there was no instructor. There was no one person saying, by the way, I've got 20 years of experience and here's how you do it safely. We needed to learn how to do it safely. There was no soft equipment, maybe a sand pit, but even those can be rare depending on where you live. So essentially we taught ourselves. Because I was so passionate, I did pick up my first scrappy backflip within like 2 months. I did play soccer. I was an energetic kid. I was also super scared of a lot of stuff. And I was barely landing my first backflip. But after 2 months as a 16-year-old, that's enough of a success for me to say, all right, cool, I'm hooked. Here was the big downside. I was so hooked that I decided, rather than picking up a standard uni path, I wanted to do this full time. And what was the best way possible back then? It was to perform. So we did lots of car commercials, car presentations. For some reason, the car economy is just paid for half of my loans as a performer so far, and for half of my fees that I earned. But then over time, I was performing as a 21-year-old, doing cool shit on stage, and finding that I'm suffering from back pain because we're performing on a car fair that's like 10 days long, 2 shows or 3 shows a day, and I just have these aches. So what looks really cool from the outside, wow, big jumps, awesome, feels just like impact from the inside. And in my heart, something within me, I'm now 31, so that was almost 10 years ago, something within me knew that, look, I love moving, I love exploration, I love learning new skills, I love all of this, but I can't do it or keep doing it if I do it the way that I did it. So then there was the thought of, there must be a way of doing this a little bit better, more efficiently. And eventually that led me to saying, it's unlikely that I can see myself progressing within parkour in a way that I'm passionate about in 10 years. But I can easily see that happening in soft acrobatics, like a floor-based discipline.
What's the difference? Why didn't you see yourself in parkour making this path, and why in soft acrobatics?
In part, it's probably because of my sort of limited mindset, but I was comparing myself to the trend of the parkour community, which is bigger jumps, more flips, more twists, more height. And I was seeing, all right, there's a movement there, and either I keep doing parkour, but I feel separate from what the culture is doing, or I can keep doing it, but it would have to change in character. So then I'm thinking ahead of myself, if I imagine I can jump in a certain way right now, what could that look like when I'm 45, when I'm 50? And my creativity wasn't sufficient to say there would be things that I would be inspired to do that I can do when I'm 50 that I can't do yet. And for me in soft acrobatics, the idea was, oh, well, if I only have the floor, what are the elements, what are the variables that I can change? In parkour, you can change distances, you can change heights, you can change the obstacles. If I only have the floor, the only option that I have to do is to change myself, to change my own body. So then I started thinking about appropriate flexibility, appropriate strength, appropriate coordination. And if I'm thinking in these like the simplified little triangle, I can see myself progressing in versions or sectors of strength, of flexibility, of coordination in my own body for a freaking long time ahead. Like a wonderful example for me is I'm really bad at backbending naturally. Soccer player, I haven't backbended my whole life. Like if you were asking me to arch, it just didn't happen in my body. Like I can look back and up, but that was about it. And then I was like, I'm trying to improve this flexibility arching thing, but it looks to me like if I try to do it in like 3 months, there's not a lot that's going to happen. And the people that I admired, they were moving so beautifully, effortlessly, and elegantly that I was like, it doesn't matter to me if it takes 5 or 10 years to, for example, achieve a back walkover, which is dropping back from standing into a bridge to then walk over, ideally in one smooth motion. I remember specifically setting that goal for myself, I think when I was 25 maybe. I was thinking, if when I'm 40, I can do a back walk over, I've reached a goal. And it would be something that I can imagine. It doesn't matter to me if it takes 15 years, if I can eventually get it. And then I think like 2 years ago, I did my first back walk over. It wasn't even that grand. It wasn't like, yay, finally I ticked it off the list. It was more like, what are the other things that I can keep searching for where if I were to look at a 10-year time horizon, there's a realistic, smooth progress curve that just means I've become better, I've become freer in what I can do.
What seems to me to be the case with this practice is that it is, in a sense, very modern. And what I mean with that is the individualization part. So you mentioned before gymnastics. which is very unindividual in the sense of the movements need to be performed in a certain way. The next thing is that it opened up the things, and there's this street style things. And then after that, a merge happens. A merge happens out of the merge, you could say, because if we take breaking already took things from all sorts of disciplines, no? Or contemporary dance, where first there was ballet, then there was modern dance, and then there's contemporary. And contemporary, it's basically, for me, it feels like it's a term of, if you're a professional contemporary dancer, you better be able to do all sorts of things. And then another thing comes, like you said, soft acrobatics, that is taking again from these things that are already taken from things. So it's very interesting how that is moving through time. But one thing that is very sticking out, I feel, is it seems to go, at least momentarily, from strictness to this is how you should do it, to find your individual way to do it. And this also combined with the idea of longevity. If you find your individual way, you will be able to practice for a long time.
The first thing that I think is part of our modern times is something like what you called, I think, individualization, which could be coined as open sourcing, but it's about having better access to information. So in other words, I don't need to rely on the one person who's the head of the gym, the head of the gymnasium, that is teaching me how to do the perfect gymnastic tumbling vault. Access was restricted. I needed to, the best way to learn it was from the person who'd done gymnastics for 20 years, but they're not going to teach me about breaking. So then, of course, one element that we have is just, we have so much easier access and entry points to all the knowledge that exists in the acrobatic realm. And I do think what you pointed out really well too is the way to do something sustainably in the long run is if I find the path that works best for me personally. Because it is true that you can just move much more easily on a tumbling floor if your goal is to do double backflips if you're 1.50 meters and not 1.80 meters tall. So there's like these natural constraints that come up where you'll find most gymnasts are sort of below 160. So if I'm not 160, does it mean I'm not good at gymnastics? It means that I have more trouble rotating at least around my longitudinal axis. But when it comes to something as refined as expression, there's plenty of contemporary dancers who might be taller. And then I can start to see myself not as, do I fit the archetype of the individual practice? Do I feel like a gymnast? Do I feel like a breaker? Do I feel like whatever the substitute, the acrobatic version that I'm interested in? I can start to look and think, what do I actually feel like? What do I aspire to be like? What would it look like if I could build a Lego set where I don't have the Lego set that says build the Star Wars Death Star, but instead I have a bunch of Lego sets and I can build my own little chunky cheeky version of a clown universe, Lego, Star Wars, Marvel combination Dreamcast. And I find that is much more interesting.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Something that I wanted to touch on a little bit is the strictness that comes with, I think, traditional practices, where there's a lot of value placed in the experience and the knowledge of the lineage. But if I think knowledge of lineages, that by definition must be greater than the knowledge of a single lineage. So now we have a problem, because the knowledge of the lineage is already somewhat crystallized, and it comes down to what are the best, most efficient paths to ways to learn this one thing. It's a way of crystallizing it. But now that I've got lineages, and I could take from all of those different disciplines, what is the framework? Where do I start? Do I just look at a breaker and then copy what they're doing? That's probably not a good idea. And here's where I think we've got this huge opportunity with something like soft acro, which is just putting a name to what do we do if we have all the knowledge, all the access points. How do we now start to make sense of the movements? And here's what I think is currently happening. Different acrobatic teachers are creating their own frameworks. And the frameworks, the good ones, I think, start to become principle-based frameworks. It's looking at what is the fundamental piece that what are the building blocks that are similar to all good acrobatic instructions. And I think the practice that can come out of that will just make it way, way easier for anyone to start learning acrobatics. Like we've seen the same thing in something like as disciplined or as difficult as hand balancing. Or even in the calisthenics community, the planche, the infamous planche. When I remember when there was a YouTube video of someone doing a full planche, and it was freaking amazing because there was like 2 people in the world that I thought could do it. The amount of people who can planche today is just infinitely larger than that. Why is that? Because chances are there wasn't just one YouTuber who said, this is the way you have to planche, but there's a ton of them. And then I, as a practitioner, don't have to follow the lineage that I may or may be lucky that I fit that archetype or not. But instead I can look at what do all the YouTube coaches who say, this is how you learn a planche, say, have in common. And then I can also start to say, well, this guy is an extremely good planche, but it's sort of rubbish what he's saying. So the opportunity, but also the difficulty is the well of access points that we have. And that's what I'm trying to simplify on my own channel and with my own sort of way of teaching soft acro.
So this I find very, very interesting. You send me a picture that is called like a framework that is called Soft Acro Manual to Master Movement Skills. Shall we dive a little bit into this? Because that I think would be very interesting, because it would maybe further go into the topic of adults learning the stuff. And there's another question on the side, a very big question popping up, which is the question about the why, but we will go into that a little bit later, I would say. And
absolutely
move forward into the path that you use for acrobatic progress. So what I see here is, you're right, problem of induction repetition, problem of starting point, problem of the repetition plateau, and problem of strength flexibility threshold. Can you introduce us to your method?
Absolutely. I would love to share more. I want to sidetrack for a second before going there. And I have the image in front of me as well. We'll get there in a second. And I want to make this practical too, because I think there's simple concepts to understand that it takes, if I do a good job at communicating and if we're on the same wavelength, it takes 30 seconds to understand something and to have a not only inspiration, but an immediate idea of how your next gym session can look like, or your next training session, or the next time you're on a walk and there's some grass. So I'd love to get to those really practical, principle-based approaches as well. But before that, there's something, we had a call beforehand where we were chatting about what's the meaning of acrobatics? Why is it interesting? And of course, the first thing that I want to preface is acrobatics is not interesting to everyone, and it doesn't have to be. And someone who's thinking like, actually, I've never wanted to do a cool backflip, somersault, triple twist, that's completely fine. But what I'm wondering is what could be the fascination and the inspiration that makes acrobatics into something so like I see so many kids, literally the ones outside that, just walk across the street when I do some flow, who're saying like, who're looking, who're standing there, who're starting to cartwheel, who're starting to try first macacos. The adults that are like just attracted by that novel thing that is happening over there. You almost always see really positive, like people have this sense of, for some reason, I'm attracted to what this person is doing. And I tend to be a smiley guy in public. I'm not super grim and dark. I wear bright colors a lot of the times. I'm not the most intimidating guy. So, I'm sure that has part to do with it too. But I also think there's something about that you mentioned in our call last time, which is acrobatics is something like showing that you have an abundance of energy, that you're taking time to do something that is beyond what's required. It's not just strength for the day-to-day. It's not just I do what my sports needs me to do. It's something more like I have an interest, a desire, and purely out of that interest, a desire, I manifest my movement abilities. I can learn skills simply because they call out to me, not because anyone tells me to do it, not because there's a direct reward to it. It's simply the conversation between my own body, myself, and the ideas that come to mind. And I think this process, this refining, this sharpening of there's something that I want to do simply because I feel called to do it. I want to do it almost only because it's difficult. Like, of course, there's freedom in it. There's a sense of like some movements, they just feel the way they look. Like if you're asking me what a rise feels like, I'll say it feels like flying. And it is what still brings me to want to practice it. But beyond that, I think it's also this, no one is telling me what I should look like, feel like, which are the skills that I do. I simply do them out of a genuine desire. And that's even though I'm, this is my career, this is my profession. This does matter to me, but the movements that I do are completely not dictated. And this, I think, has some inspirational value. It's when I choose to read the books that I find in the bookstore that no one told me about, that I just discovered, and I read the back of the cover, and I start to find my own little library, my own little author, like corner of authors that I'm so passionate about, even though no one told me about. I have to read them. Like the most boring videos are the 5 authors that you have to read, otherwise you'll fail at X. I think the interesting thing is when I start to notice, like, for some reason, this like green envelope over there, it just wants something from me. And suddenly it starts to feel a lot more like I'm in touch with myself rather than I'm just following what everyone tells me I should do. So this, I think, this fascination is something that I've been trying to grasp. And you put something towards the last time we were talking, which now that I've said a bunch of things, I would love to hear if I hit the spot, or as I know you've got some things to add to that understanding of why acrobatics could be interesting for adults who don't benefit or have a career from it.
I think there is usually a difference, or often, let's say, a difference why people start to why people continue. So why would people start acrobatics? I would imagine because it looks astonishing. It looks, it looks, maybe that's enough to say without an adjective. It looks. And then there might be a thing going on in the head. What is happening from that? Like, if I do that, like, what does that give me? And often when we see something, we are just thinking about the surface area of what it gives. Yeah. Like, for example, things like this that show exuberance in the sense of abundance of energy, can be impressive to others also. So that can be a reason for people to do it, that I want to be able to do that to impress others, which is for many people not so sustainable as a motivation to do for a long time. So the question is, let's say if someone starts because of that to impress others, I think that will happen a lot with such a practice. What is happening after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, if they still continue? Did their relationship to it change? And I can imagine that what can happen to many people is that they see there is something more of depth there, which is the development of the self, to say it very confined. And I found it very interesting how you said, doing it because it's difficult. And that, of course, can be also like an outside thing, like to do something that is difficult is impressive. But is it an inner, and this is like a question that, like an open question, like, is that an inner interest of us humans to do something difficult? Because on the other hand, it also seems to be in conflict with the urge that we have to have like an easy life, where it's like, I want to relax. I want to, just have things flowing to me. Like the food should just fly into my mouth. And then on the other hand, there seems to be an urge of doing difficult things. So this I find very interesting.
My mind immediately takes me to, I feel like I'm a fairly pragmatic person, which in some part might just mean anxious. I might just really want the future to work out well. And in that regard, I'm like, not all paths lead to the desired outcomes that I'm looking for. I am a big believer in the meaning of interest and joy, but I'm also thinking, at least for myself in my day-to-day, if something is worthwhile and I do it, I tend to feel better doing and after the activity. If I know how to deal with desirable levels of difficulty, if I have already understood the framework that challenge is usually something that, even though there's discomfort, We know, like, for example, in sports psychology, a common example is that expert performers interpret the sense of arousal before a big match not as anxiety, but as excitement. But when it comes to measuring the physiology and the like pulse going up and I don't know, more sweating, more even thoughts racing, things like that, essentially anything that we can measure looks pretty much the same. The expert performer who thinks, this is exciting, I'm so freaking ready for my match, versus the beginner performer who feels like I'm just anxious, I've got no clue what's going to happen. And I think this sort of this reframe of how do I perceive challenge is something extremely meaningful. It does not matter where I learned the initial lesson from. Some people, I think, are lucky they pick it up from school. Like some of the learning coaches I follow, they're like, I freaking aced those tests at school. It was so much fun. I love studying. I love breaking my head over a difficult problem. And for me, that wasn't the case at all in school. Like I didn't see the point in studying. But then I learned the desirable difficulty lesson through parkour, through facing, a 9-foot, 10-foot wall and not getting it 50 times in a row, returning back 2 weeks later, not getting it for 50 times in a row and coming back the third time and finally making the jump. Like that's something that I've learned. And so in that regard, I think where someone learns the lessons is not so important, but here's the big crux. I think we can only learn the lesson of desirable difficulty in environments that call out to us, that are meaningful to us, or where we're forced to go through them. If I enlist in the army, I have to conquer a desirable difficulty. If I have any sort of meaning, and I didn't go to the army, but if I want to stick around in the army, then I'm forced to go through this difficult cycle, and ideally I get rewarded as well because, I get myself through the mud and then whatever, like I have a bigger meal after. I don't know how the army works. I'm completely clueless. But this, like a lesson of desirable difficulty, I think it's one that I don't see successful in a purely subjective sense, in a purely I feel I've got control over this aspect of my life. I don't see successful people get around the lesson of desirable difficulty. Now, the question is, where can I best learn that lesson? And if there's this calling out, the sense of, it's not only something impressive, it's something that calls out to me because it has a sense of this might be doable. Like for me, just enlisting to the army was never a doable thing in my mind. There was no, I'm sure I could learn difficult stuff there, but it wasn't a thing where I could see myself signing a paper and being like, I will serve and fight for my country. Like it wasn't an option. But in climbing a wall in parkour and then later on learning a difficult acrobatic move, which I still do daily, like almost every practice, not daily, I don't practice acrobatics every day, but I would say 2 or 3 times a week when I do my acro practice, I'm at that threshold right there, right at the point where I'm like, I don't know exactly that I can do this. It feels difficult. I wonder how I could do it safely and push my own limits a little bit. And that's where I feel if the thing calls out, it looks impressive, but it also looks doable, then my inner compass tells me something like interest. It's interesting to me. It's a book on the bookshelf that freaking has equations on the cover. And I'm like, I don't know equation stuff. Math seems difficult, but I still want to pick it up. That's what I'm looking for. When someone has this as a student, people I talk to, I always do calls before they start doing one-on-one work with me. Essentially what I'm asking for is, do you have this interest? Do you have this, does it call out to you? What have you already done? What have you tried? What didn't work? And if they just keep sharing with me that, well, this didn't work out, and then I tried that, and this performance, then I saw on Instagram that story, and it didn't work out, and I see they have this interest, then I'm like, okay, cool. They're going to learn the lesson of desirable difficulty really easily.
And I think your work does something important here, because acrobatics might be perceived as something that is too difficult to learn. And this is especially, of course, if just the high end is shown. And weirdly enough, for many people, it's difficult to imagine the path, that there is a path. Yeah, it's like, this is way beyond what I can do, so I cannot do that. And yes, it is way beyond what you can do. It might be way beyond what you can learn in your life, but still every practice, plus minus whatever, if there's has an entry point. And this is what you're doing, is you show people an entry point into this realm of soft acrobatics. So I hope that this is happening, that people see your stuff and from colleagues that do a similar approach, and people get the idea of, yes, if I practice, if I put time in, then it's possible to learn things there and to improve. So this is a practice that is inviting. I can start. So making things approachable and doable, I think that's one of the huge missions that is in the room here for such practices that are perceived as difficult to learn.
Absolutely. I feel like you summed up what I think my mission is on socials. It is to show that there's a path to master the difficult. By the way, I just enrolled into university to study sports science, and I'm understanding when I do something like an aerial, which is a cartwheel without hands, the total amount of effort that it takes couldn't even be compared with something like a squat jump. Not even remotely. It's something that takes so much less energy than any sort of more athletic acrobatic feat, like jumping up 7 stairs from with both feet and landing with both feet. There's just effort that's undeniable. But I'm really curious actually of what are the hard limiters of acrobatics? How much is it true that you're seeing this amazing performer and you'll never learn this in your lifetime, which may be the breadth of it, not so much. But if you're looking at, if I want to take on a difficult challenge in my life, and I say, look, I'm going to be around for a while, I want to do things that are healthy, I want to do things that ideally build some strength, some flexibility, and some coordination. I want to learn how to fall because I know it's going to matter when I'm 70. I want to learn how to keep strength and build strength because it's going to matter when I'm 70. And ideally, it matters even way earlier. Like if I injure myself, but I've already been through the process of building strength, learning how to get from the floor if I'm not allowed to use one foot, for example, then recovery will be way easier. So there's all these clear, obvious benefits of just learning to control yourself in difficult situations and improve over time. It will have benefit and transfer to life. Like that to me is somewhat inevitable with something like, I'm putting air quotes, general movement. That means for me, it's learning how to do something as specific as an Olympic lift and getting stronger through that also has great application. I personally feel that learning how to use my body on the floor and literally learn how to fall and do the wrong thing and learn how to make a lot of effort, learning how to be fast, learning how to be flexible, learning how to get in tricky situations all by myself, I think that has, for me personally, a more general transfer. Compared to or I could say an even more extreme example, dart playing. I think there's a lot of value in mastering something as difficult as playing dart. I don't think it has the greatest transfer to the rest of life. So I just want to put that in brackets. I think movement is healthy. All right, I've said the thing. I needed to say it at some point, I guess. But the interesting thing, from there on is how can I now do something difficult that calls out to me in a sustainable way, in a way, not even sustainable, just how can I master the difficult thing? And I think, I want to open one thing and close it right away, which is, I think the common way of skill learning, that skill learning is interpreted, is that it's either a set of stairs or it's a single ladder that I climb up. It's the progressions, progression 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Whenever I've got numbers, I think I have to do number 1 first, then number 2. If I skip step number 3, then it's going to bite me back later, and so on and so forth. I think what's more accurate in skill learning is that any skill that we truly learn, we learn best if we if we explore more of the territory. That's why one of the things that I like using are skill ladders, which are multiple ways to approach a single final outcome. All right, so that was the mini rant on I think skill learning, how it's commonly understood, is not how skill learning actually happens in the best way possible. But now I've almost drifted into the sort of soft acro movement manual. Do you want to dive deeper into that, or is there something that's currently like a question mark that I completely forgot about and we could still cover?
No, let's go into this because my question mark would be about that. What do you mean with, do I understand it correctly? That what you say is, usually it's said there is one ladder, but you want to show that there are many sets of letters
Yes.
for a skill?
Yes. And I would say, in my experience, when people are first learning a skill and they end up trying it once and then not continuing, their experience was, I tried to climb the ladder, I was not good enough, full stop. This is not for me. And I think if the truth had been much clearer of, have you tried 5 ladders? Because I can guarantee you, if you have 5 ladders and you learn how to measure your progress, it's inevitable that you won't make progress. We're too much wired to be movement generalists. We're too much wired to learn motor skills. So that's the thing where I can give my students the promise, like, I guarantee you're making progress because I know it's pretty much our capacity as a human being. But if we're stuck and we say, I need this one way to learn my handstand, I need to go, I can balance 5 seconds with the wall now, I need to go and balance 5 seconds without the wall. That's usually a frustrating journey for people. The gap is too large. And then it's not the case that they're not good enough, not at all. It's the case that the knowledge wasn't sufficient. But knowledge is easy. Knowledge can be as easy as listening to this podcast and getting the idea of 2 or 3 different skill ladders that you could immediately apply to a skill that you want to learn. That knowledge is what's going to allow you to find the optimal challenge point, to have joy in training, to learn how to deal with frustration in practice, to not make the common mistakes of sort of getting stuck in a plateau and then just dropping the skill, and so on and so forth.
Okay. And in your notes that you sent me, you wrote about self-organization and constraints as primary principles for coordination learning. What does that mean?
Yes. From how I understand the sports science literature, the source of motor learning, like as in how movement skills were taught, comes from the information processing metaphor. The brain is a computer with top-down hierarchical control. I give a command in my brain, and then my body executes the command. It's this downstream way of learning movement. But what does that mean if I want to pick up a skill, suddenly I give a command and my body doesn't do the thing that my mind wants to do? It's as easy as saying, in my mind, I just want to straighten my legs in a cartwheel, but when I look on video, my legs are bent. I am broken. What's not working here? And it's the wrong way of understanding how movement learning occurs. Movement learning is not that we give commands to every single part of ourselves, be like, okay, triceps, straighten. There's a beautiful example in one of the motor learning books, which is you can take any object in front of you. It could be as simple as your phone, and you just hold out your phone in front of you. And the first kind of movement that you could do is try to only use your wrist to create a straight line, to draw a straight line. Or maybe it's even easier if I'm on camera and I use my finger, I only use my wrist to create a straight line. The point is, it doesn't work. If I have a single joint, then I can only create an arc. It won't be a straight line. It will be a curved line. All right, now that means I have to involve more than one joint, and controlling one joint is already hard. So what would it have to look like if I use my shoulder and my elbow and my finger to create one movement outcome that is a straight line? Everyone can draw a straight line in front of their face in the air, super simply, but I don't have to think for a second about which muscles are doing the work. And this is already a complex problem. It requires at minimum 2 and most of the time 3 joints that do the task. It requires me perfectly coordinating and synergizing what my shoulder is doing and what my elbow is doing and what my wrist is doing, maybe even what my finger joints are doing. So the idea is not that there's a top-down controller that gives signals to each of the parts of my body. Rather, I set myself an outcome, a goal, draw a straight line in the air. My body self-organizes to achieve that goal. Now, in acrobatics, the common thing that coaches tend to do in a more traditional way is they say, point your toe more, flex your core. And they think of the body as a marionette that can be steered by the voice of the coach, which I think the literature is pretty clear about, and you can try this for yourself, isn't the right approach of understanding how movement learning occurs. Movement learning occurs by setting a goal that's achievable. It has to be doable so that you can imagine it would be possible to do it. And then you look at what are the informations and the things that I can use to do the skill. I'll just put a picture in our minds. I think it's easier to imagine. If you know, for example, we'll start with something as simple as a cartwheel. Even if you don't know acrobatics, you know pretty much what a cartwheel looks like, right? All fours away from you, you stay more or less in the same shape, and you turn upside down like a cartwheel would. Now, if you haven't done cartwheels before, if I tell you do a cartwheel, oh, and by the way, point your toes, that's not going to help you do a cartwheel. What will help you do a cartwheel, if you've never done it, even if you're 60 years old, is you can place your hands on a table in front of you, a regular table. It has to be stable so it doesn't slide, but just any table. And then I'm asking you, draw a line, or you can even put something like a shoe just next to you. And the target that I'm giving you is step over that shoe. That's so freaking easy, everyone can do it. So I'm not telling you lift your leg. I'm not telling you think about this in your body, flex that muscle. I'm just telling you step over the shoe. And then I'm starting to make the little barrier out of shoes. I'm stacking them over one on top of the other. Maybe shoe boxes are easier to imagine. And now at some point, the shoe boxes are going to become an obstacle that you need to jump over. What's going to be a natural way for you to jump over if you have the table in front of you? You're going to do the easier thing, which is move some weight onto your hands and then jump 1 foot over the box at a time so that you have some air time. Your feet are actually both off the ground for a moment. You're sort of hurdle jumping over the shoe boxes. And that would be an example of how we're using a constraint, something that's literally constraining your ability to do stuff, which is I'm placing a shoebox you can't just step over anymore. You now have to jump over to allow your body to self-organize and find the best way of, well, learning a skill like the cartwheel. So I think a lot of the good coaching in the acrobatic landscape is not telling people what their joints should do, but rather coming up with mini games that the student can solve within a single session that's just at the right challenge point. So they start out maybe not doing it 100%. But then as they progress, they stack one more shoebox on top of that existing pile, and they themselves can see, I learned to jump higher. Does it matter to me how exactly they do it? No, and I think it shouldn't. Only when it comes to something like refining skills based on aesthetic standards. Then we can look at what do we want the joint to do. But even here, more efficient learning happens through a wide range of things. It's understanding that when I give my body a restriction, I say my arm has to be straight for whatever reason. It might just be an aesthetic preference. Suddenly I'm introducing an additional constraint that makes the movement harder. So I usually, when my coach tells me, point your toe, the initial experience will be suddenly the move that I could already do becomes harder. Why is that? Because now part of my attention, and Gabby Wolf does amazing work on this, on external cues. Essentially, when part of my attention is inside my body, it's not focused on the goal anymore, jumping over the shoeboxes. If I say now, really straighten your legs, I can even say, flex your quad muscles, feel them being active. I now have a ton of attention into all those little muscle fibers down there that won't necessarily help me actually solve the task. So I'm going to start kicking over the shoeboxes. So that's where aesthetic standards should be reserved, in my opinion, to someone who is already a proficient level of mastery or a level of proficiency in the skill that they're trying to do, make more aesthetic. But here's something that's even more, I want to bring this point down, because I think looking for aesthetic standards when learning movement skills is not useful. Here's the cool thing. The best way, if you want to make your backflip flash kick more elegant, is do a ton of different variations of normal backflips. So can I do a gainer? Can I do a layout? Can I do a touch my own toes in the air? Can I touch opposite knees in the air? Can I straighten my legs for a split second? So a lot of the practice will then revolve around my body finding out simply what is the most efficient way to do any backflip. What's the thing they all have in common? When I'm so good that I can do all these variations, then I can start to introduce aesthetic cues again.
I think for the listener, to make that point very clear, is for many people it's not so easy or not so clear how to, for example, flex the muscles at the chest. You know, this bodybuilder style, just standing and flex the muscle. But automatically it will flex when you press something away. And I find it very interesting how much we are, like you said, wired to solve problems. Yeah. Instead of, okay, now I'm trying to just think about every little piece of how do I move this joint and this joint and so on. It can be a very interesting practice to go into that. So to not go for externally solving a problem, but actually to understand how to move all your joints and flex the muscles and so on and so forth. But in our daily life, when we move, when we walk, we solve the problem of walking in that sense, and we don't think about different joints or different muscles and so on. But then on top of it, and this is what I think maybe can be added there, because there's the aesthetics thing, but there can be also the thing of dysfunction, that maybe you have a dysfunction that's creeped in through many years, and then it can make sense to add to solving the problem of walking, for example, a certain detail that you look at. Maybe how you step with your feet, or the position of your pelvis or something like this. So in rehabilitation,
can I ask you about that?
That's also...
if you're giving a cue, this is the understanding that I have of what you might be saying, and then what I think the common way of using it is, in rehabilitation, people can sometimes instruct and say, your hip doesn't extend when you step more. You need to work on hip extension, which is a very mechanical view of the body, right? If you do this, you will be better. This is the crux. Or are you introducing it as a constraint of saying, try out this way and see if it changes something, and then try out something different to find out what's optimal for you? Because one would be, there's an optimal technique, I know it, and you have to get it from me, I'll teach you how to do it. The other one would be, we actually are pretty clueless about optimal technique in really many fields, and especially when it comes to the nitty-gritty, but our bodies are good at finding their individual best technique if we give them the greatest exposure to different kinds. So I'm guessing you're speaking about the second, or do you have that more mechanistic view, and maybe there's something I have to learn about where I'm not precise enough in my thinking?
No, I think the problem that many people have is because they don't move a lot, is the normal solutions to problems are very often not so good, because things became dysfunctional through time. Like the way they walk or stand up or jump, might really not be so great. So if people move a lot in different scenarios, like you said, like if they just broaden the way they move and try to walk like this, try to walk like this, stand up like that, stand up like that. This is where I also think that many things will change for the person to the better. The question that always arises in me, what is the best approach in that sense, but what is the realistic approach also? And this is where this mechanistic view can be helpful if it can be just giving a person one thing, like the physiotherapist that tells the person, something about their gait, do it like this. And then this person that is, not interested in, like you cannot get the person to move more and to try lots of different things. The person is just not interested, but you can still, through that approach, that is not it's not the highest, the best way, but it doesn't matter what is the best way in general. I think it matters what is the way that the person is doing, and the person can improve that. So in that sense, I would not necessarily disregard any approach, but often, like you also, have an approach that I would prefer to do and like to do, and then I have other approaches that I can also use if that approach doesn't work. And I think that happens to me all the time, actually.
Something that I really like about doing isolated work is that it does increase proprioception. In my experience, right now, I can tell you if my hip opening when I landed a Webster was the way that I wanted to, even before I rewatch my video. I pretty much know what it feels like. So it can upgrade proprioception, but proprioception, which is essentially sensing what my body positions are in space without any visual input. That's one way of thinking about it. That is a fuzzy sense. And for some people, it's a really clear example. If you close your eyes and you bring both hands next to you, and with your eyes closed, you raise them slowly overhead, very slowly, try to get a sense for when they're about to meet. And my original experience when I did this first is I thought my hands were about to meet way sooner then they were actually meeting. That would be an example of fuzzy proprioception. And in that regard, I would say, literally, we can just train ourselves. Like, I've done this so often now that I have a pretty good sense, like, what's the kind of stretch that I'm feeling? When do my hands meet overhead? And that is helpful, but it's, for me, also is a complementary part. I would say it's a micro exploration practice. And any field in my body that I explore, I'll become more competent in. But when it comes to things like improving my running posture, then oftentimes it's a lot easier for the beginner, in my experience, to explore things like step cadence, because I can have a beat per minute count that beats 180 times per minute, so 3 times per second, ta, 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 and I can try to match my step frequency to that. And I can try out different cadences, and that's a way easier task to very quickly get amazing results, letting the body self-organize to find something that's more economical, more efficient, versus telling someone while they're running that they need to extend their hip more, usually creates odd movement artifacts. And that's, at least from my perspective as an acrobatic coach, being too precise in proprioceptive practice too early on, when my personal goal is for people to teach them how to learn movement skills. That's why they come to me first. I'm not teaching people how to walk with a more upright posture. Then I would be doing a different practice. So I do think it has value, and different people should probably do proprioceptive practice first. But if they come to me for learning acrobatic skills, it's something that I'll introduce quite a bit later in their sort of training career in acrobatics.
Can you tell the listener what is proprioceptive practice?
Yeah. So for me, essentially, we've got these main senses of orientation that tell us where we are in space without, having a video camera looking back at myself. I've got my visual system, I've got my vestibular system, and I've got my proprioceptive system. My visual system, we know. Like, if I look in any room or through the window, I see the horizon line, it tells me, am I upright or not? And that's an important sense for knowing where and how we are oriented in space. The other sense is the vestibular sense, the little marbles inside our ear that tell us something about if we're tilted or not. And then the proprioceptive sense about body positioning has to do more with sensing probably things like a fascial stretch, or it could be a muscle stretch, about gathering information that we sense that tell us about where and how we are in space. So for me, a proprioceptive practice would be something where I want to learn how do I understand where I am in space. And that could be done for something as simple as first standing in front of a mirror and simply lifting and lowering my shoulder. And I'll start to get a sense of what it feels like when my shoulder is elevated and I pull my shoulder towards my ear, or when it's depressed and I'm pulling it sort of towards my pockets. And this sense, this lifting and lowering the shoulder, can later on help me in handstand practice if I want to try to find better or more efficient versions of stacking myself and supporting myself and balancing myself. So for me, the proprioceptive practice would be that, in quotation marks, isolated practice, whenever I pay attention to a single body part. But the expectation that this will quickly make me better at the skill, I think, is often misplaced. I think sort of the culture that I see places too much emphasis on learn how to lift your shoulders up and down, and could be benefiting from more external cues. For example, ideally, when I'm teaching someone how to do a handstand and I'm with them in person, I would simply press down against their feet and I would tell them, push my hand away. They immediately will do all the things necessary to get more elevation. If I personally believe that in handstands, having more shoulder elevation makes my handstands easier or more stable to balance. So that's where, if possible, I'll always try to find ways with my online students, especially, to say, what are these external challenges? Maybe you can put a yoga block onto your feet while you're against the wall, and your goal is to get the yoga block as high as possible. And whatever benefits we want to get in terms of like creating tension throughout the body is probably faster to get that sense than if I were to tell people, first learn how to stack your ribs properly, feel how your core is active, lift your shoulder. These are just many things to keep in mind of, where with the right cue, I could probably get all of them in one go and I don't even have to learn a muscle name. But I'm also genuinely not sure if I did justice to my description of what proprioceptive practices are. I think that's just sort of my hand-waving way of making sense of it.
I think it's clear I might play the
devil's advocate.
I might
Do it.
allow myself. I allow myself to ask the question: if faster is always better in the end. That was coming up with me, but because I have this also often that I think, actually you learn faster like this, and this is the idea also. Well, let's phrase it differently, or that's. I recently talked with one of my students about the work of Professor Schellhorn, where he was also mentioning a lot the speed of learning when you do this differential learning that Schellhorn talks about. Yeah. And then for me, this question comes up, like, how much is speed an issue? How important is that in that sense? Like, I understand that there is a quality in speed in learning something fast, but it leaves me with a little bit with a, I'm not 100%. That's not what convinces me 100%. To say this is better, that is faster.
I'm totally with you on that as well. The reason why speed is interesting for me, so first of all, the spirit of longevity is literally saying something like, if I give myself a time horizon of 15 years, and now I'm asking myself, what do I want to do in those 15 years? What I can accomplish is probably far more interesting than if I say, what can I do in the next 3 months? It doesn't inspire me that much to think about what I can do in the next 3 months. It does inspire me a lot of, I think, like, what can I build in 15 years within my personal practice, with my personal life, friendships, relationships, knowledge that I acquire, content that I produce, teaching methods that I learn myself and that I hopefully put together. So I wouldn't say that doing the 3 months thing is meaningful, but on my 15-year journey, my goal is to get hooked on as many positive practices as I can that will make it more likely that I get my 15-year goal. So let's say I do want to become a professor at some point, which, right now I'm not so sure, but we'll see. If it was my goal to become a professor, I should probably find a way to get hooked on reading literature, scientific literature, and at producing quality research. And there is going to be the point where if it takes me 3 years to publish my first paper, is it going to take 2 to publish my next? I'm not sure. But that's where I feel like at least the speed of learning is one of the triggers that we can use to get faster feedback cycles that get me hooked. Even if I do it wrong, I have a slightly better idea of how to do it better next time. So I think what I'm interested in is more something like faster feedback circles. And if I do a proprioceptive practice, then at least the drawback I feel could be something like that. At least, when I do spinal waves to warm up, I often get people who are interested, who are like, what are you doing? This looks so interesting. This looks fun. But when I would actually cue them through a couple of the motion, you can see them lose interest within like a minute. They're like still keeping a generous smile on their face. And they're like, yeah, this is cool. And it doesn't answer the question, why the frick am I doing this? It sort of looks nice when he does it, but I don't know why I'm doing it. So if I want to have a feedback in that, of course I could do proprioceptive feedback training, which might be something as silly as, I don't know, balancing the stick on my shoulder. And in the process, I'm like getting better at balancing a stick on my shoulder. But I'm also learning a lot about different shoulder positions. If my goal is to, I don't know, I could do it sitting in a chair and then my shoulder immediately has to do more work. Whereas if I'm doing it standing upright, probably my feet are going to do a lot of the carry. So I wouldn't say speed is a necessary component of good practice at all, but it's one of the tools I can use to get myself hooked. If I make faster progress, if I get more feedback, which allows me to make faster progress, chances that I'll keep doing it is much, much greater.
Yes, that would be also for me the reason why it makes, in a recreational setting, sense to look at speed. If we're in a performance setting, obviously it makes sense to look at speed of progression. But if we are in a recreational setting, it would make sense for me to look at speed, because it is very likely that this will increase the likelihood that someone is continuing the practice. Yes. Although there's a cap to that, if something is suddenly solved very quickly, then it can be a little bit like going somewhere with an airplane and suddenly you're there and like you don't know how you got there. Like there's like a maximum speed that makes sense in order to let our whole being arrive.
100%.
Yeah.
I used to give these 2-hour backflip workshops, which I stopped doing, which I'm not going to continue doing either, which were super fun for the participants. But the most important part was the last 15 minutes of the workshop. Because I was telling people, I just taught you the direct path. It requires all this equipment. It requires all this spotting. It requires all this nerves and fear, and it's exciting. But what's more interesting is the thorough path, where you not only learn how to backflip, but you also learn how to do the backflip wrong in all sorts of ways and still be unfazed, not have a scratch while you land funnily. And then, of course, the thorough path is learning how to go slanted, sideways, how to open up early, how to even learn how to land on your shoulder, which is way better than learning on an extended neck, for example. And the thorough path, I kept telling people, that's the path where chances are, if you really want to learn a backflip, you'll still have it in 5 years from now, because you'll have discovered it. If you do the direct path, it will actually take a lot of repetition style practice where you keep either psyching yourself up, or like one of my friends had this thing, he would go and do 30 backflips every day for I think 2 months straight until he lost the fear of the backflip. I think he can still backflip, but man, those were 2 intense months. And if you're unlucky and you have a hard fall, you don't recover from it. So many people don't know, like, I could do a backflip once, but then I landed funnily and now I'm freaking scared. Reasonably so, like you might have really seriously hurt yourself. So the interest that I then have is more like, okay, I saw that people were excited for the backflip workshop, but I shifted my interest to saying, how can I get them hooked on the thorough path? Because that is the more rewarding path in half a year, in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years. So I didn't want to give out the drug anymore. I felt like that was we're aligned in that. Yes. There's a speed of learning that's sort of empty.
Definitely.
And there's one that's rich.
Mm-hmm. And now, if people come to you, and this is mainly through online coaching, so how does that work? Like, how do people start to learn their first acrobatic moves?
I would love to turn this a bit into how I in general teach, and I want to make it practical first. So even someone who is not signing up for anything with me, they would start to have an idea of how to learn a skill. The first thing I can funnily recommend is, if you're really interested in learning acrobatics, go on my Instagram channel and please scroll through the material of the last 1 year. Like, there's a ton of really good, interesting insights in how you could start learning acrobatics. If you watch 5 videos, I would be hard pressed to say that you wouldn't get an idea of how to learn from at least one of them. And I've been even becoming more educational. I really want to make it possible. When it comes to someone saying, I sort of have a remote interest. Aaron, what you're doing sounds interesting. You're saying adults can learn acrobatics and they can do it safely. They can develop strength along the way, but importantly, it's also fun. It's low risk. So where do you want me to start? In that regard, the first thing that I'll ask anyone that I'm working with more closely is, what are you interested in? And of course, the first thing is what do you mean? Acrobatics, it's cool. And then I will ask more something like, what are the recent acrobatic posts that you liked? What are the movers that you follow? What is a YouTube video that you have in your history where you're like, this was so cool? And then what in that video actually feels to you like it's calling out to you, it's calling your name? Because that thing that's whispering your name, Joseph, come on, learn me, I'm interesting. That thing likely tells us something about what is currently plausible for you to learn. That's super important. And it might be that you're interested in rolling, in soft transitions, into the art of falling, into for some reason it's fascinating to you how you could, someone throws themselves in the air and they effortlessly roll it off. It could be. But it also could be that there's just this weird leg movement someone is doing. And it's so beautiful. It turns out it's an arching type of movement. It turns out it has a lot of hip extension. It turns out it has an active split in their legs. That could be the thing for you. Or it might be a version of a jump. It might be a version of these softer flow that have more spins and sweeps in them, like an animal flow type thing, where you can sort of I thought this would be cool. That's the first thing that I need to know from someone who's interested. What is the area? Once you've got this, even if you are now thinking about a move, I think this is a relatively easy exercise if someone already found acrobatic inspiration. If they haven't found acrobatic inspiration, I recommend go for the hashtag acrobatics or hashtag soft acrobatics on Instagram. Just scroll through it for 5 minutes. You'll know. You'll know when you stop, when you pause, and you're like, this was freaking awesome. What she did just there, that's the kind of stuff that I want to do. So having a genuine interest, that's point number one. From there on, there's the problem of the starting point, which is like, now that I've got this amazing thing that I want to learn, seriously though, how do I get started? And for that, what helps me a ton is looking at the movement. Usually I'll download it to my phone, I'll screen record it, or use an app for it. And then I'll just scrub through the movement and I'll pause all the different parts. Usually if you group a movement into an entry, transition, and an exit, you've got 3 key points in there. And then I can start to look at, these are what I call the roots of the movement. What are the specific shapes that you have to transition into? The first thing that I then want to do is have an idea of where my physical abilities are in relationship to that skill. If the movement that someone is doing has a handstand in it, then I can't currently balance a handstand, I at least want to know, could I put some weight on my hands when I'm upside down? So for example, I've got my weight on my hands and I do a downward dog. That's easy, I know it from yoga. All right, I'm going to put my feet on a stable chair. It feels a bit more tricky, but now my hip is still sort of dangling in between my feet and my hands. Can I maybe walk my hands closer towards my feet? And then I'll start to have an idea of like, man, this being upside down is actually quite tricky. Or I might find out, I can hold this for a minute, easy. That starts to give us an idea when we look at the roots of the movement of how close my physical capacities are to the final thing. Because sometimes you're surprising yourself and sometimes you're just getting an honest self-check-in. And the next part is key, it's crucial. If you don't fulfill the physical requirements, that's where skill ladders come in. Where we don't just segment and isolate the move. That's what I just spoke about, right? Just take the first part of it, see if you can do it, and then, you either have it or you don't. All right, cool, isolation is cool. What's more interesting for learning is, can you imagine a way of shrinking the skill? And now a bit of creativity and understanding is asked, but I think we can talk through it. I think we get it. And I think when you have ideally, right now, you have a movement in mind. It's a cartwheel. It's a cartwheel with one arm. It's a cartwheel without arms. It's a handstand type movement. It's a type of roll. It's like, if the listener is with us, then have some movement in. Maybe for me, for a while, it was a back handspring, catching myself in a handstand and sticking the handstand. So these were the kind of things that I had in mind. There was a takeoff point. I don't want to jump too far back. I don't want to jump too high. So this is a part of it. Then there's a catching in a handstand, the arching position. All I would do is look at a performer who does the back handspring to handstand. I scrub through the footage and I can imagine, if I were to find a way to minimize this thing, what could I minimize here? And maybe I let this sit for a while. If someone can imagine a back handspring, which is right, it's a back handspring is a backflip, but you put your hands on the ground in between. Now imagine you're putting your hands in the ground in between, and you stay there. That's a back handspring to handstand, or back fall to handstand, however we want to call it. So how can I make this smaller? Can I just land halfway? Not really. Halfway means I'm just landing on my back. And I'm not a big gym guy. You need crash mats to learn acrobatics. So what's another way of simplifying the skill? There are several. One of them is doing a macaco instead, which is essentially something like a back handspring, where my one hand is resting behind me on the floor even before I take off. That means at no point do I have a complete jump. At every point, one part of my body is in contact with the ground. So now the question is, can I do a macaco and catch myself in a handstand? Now, this is an advanced skill, and what I'm saying is we can do the same thing for any skill that exists. Here is a mini acronym that you can use to think creatively about ways that you can shrink the skill. The acronym is DASH. DASH is D-A-S-H. It stands for distance, angle, level of support, and height. So I'm going to break these down in a second. Let's see. Distance is if I do something like, what's a good skill? Right, in the beginning, if I do a cartwheel, the perfect cartwheel, let's say I have a performer in mind and I sort of lay out where their handprints and their footprints are. Let's say the takeoff foot to the landing foot travels for 1.5 meters, but the performer is completely stretched out in the air. That's a distance that I could start shrinking. What would the cartwheel look like if I made it shorter? And what you'll find there is you can start to then, for example, put your hands slightly further behind yourself so that you can fulfill on that constraint. It's what Rachel Locks and Keith Barn would call a staggered cartwheel, where instead of doing a cartwheel on one line, you're placing your hands behind yourself so that the feet can close more closely together, which is also a way of learning an aerial quicker. That's too much for now, I think. More of that another time. So I've got a distance in mind. How can I make that distance smaller? Another part that we can look at in the cartwheel is the angle. If I lay out one straight line and have my little angle measure, then I'll find out that it's a 180-degree line or just a straight line, right? The angle is just straight. So can I shrink that angle? Can I make it a 90-degree angle? Does it make it any easier? And the answer most of the time is yeah. If I don't want a cartwheel all the way through, then that does make the angle easier. By the way, it's also a way to make a cartwheel harder. You can do a 180 cartwheel, try opening up the angle, and you'll find yourself in something like a Gumby, which is an arching cartwheel. So it's just about what are the different tools, the different measures I could apply that I can change. The next one would be level of support. And for me, a supporting surface is something I do use a lot, which could just be that chair or a table, a couch, a park bench, which funnily enough, the park benches tend to be a little bit lower than normal chairs. So they're sort of a nice in-between height. And if I put my hands on a supporting surface, then the cartwheel also becomes easier, combining that with an angle, at least. Not if I want a cartwheel straight over it. But that's how I can then have a supporting surface and change that in height. But support could also be something like having a supporter who assists me. I'm not a big fan of spotting, but in big part because I focus so much on online coaching, and I think having a bad spotter will make you learn acrobatics worse. Having a great spotter who really knows what they're doing can give you an advantage, but there's something that I know the pole dancers, spotting syndrome, I think is what they call it, where you can always do it when your coach has a hand just at your back, but once the coach is not there anymore, then you sort of can't do it anymore. And of course, there's ways of solving this too. But I don't like working with spotters, but it would be a way of using it. Another way of support could be if I want to learn an aerial, and at first I want to do a one-arm cartwheel, but currently a one-arm cartwheel is too hard for me. So I use 5 fingertips as support on the second hand. And that's a level of support that I can change because I can do it 4 fingertips. And I know that on one additional fingertip, I can use way less weight than on 4 fingertips or on 5. That is to practice use with some caution, but it's another way of playing with the level of support that I'm getting. And of course, any sort of crash mat. A thick crash mat, if I do have it, will give me more support than mental support. Then a thinner crash mat and grass will give me more support when it comes to crash landing than concrete. So support I can change. Just to recap, we've got distance, we've got angle, we've got support, and we've got height, which height actually means something more like time spent in the air. And here's a cool thing if you're using a smartphone. For almost all jumping skills, if you have an iPhone, but if you don't have an iPhone, use the app Frame Grabber. You can scrub through the footage frame by frame, and you'll get little clues about measuring your progress. So for example, let's say you do want to learn the aerial, the no-hand cartwheel. Instead of doing an aerial right away, trying it and failing 100 times, that would be probably not such a good learning strategy. What you can do is, can I do, you can ask yourself, can I do a cartwheel? But I want my hands to be a split second in the air before I put them on the ground. So my foot launches me into the air, then I place my hands on the ground, and I have a tiny amount of height added to that. And what I can do in the app is just look, today I managed to stay in the air for 2 frames. Next time, your only goal is to stay in the air for 3 frames. That's a freaking small increment of progress. Like, as in, it would be 1/30th of a second that you're longer in the air. And oftentimes people, one of my main jobs as a coach online is to show my students how they're making progress. One of the most common messages that I get when I give my students video analyses is, oh, thanks, actually I didn't know I was progressing. And I'm like, of course, do you see this part is so much more like you can now see the ground for way longer just from looking at where your position of the head is in space. Your hip now is higher than it used to be. And oftentimes it's something as, in quotation marks, small as 5 degrees or 15 degrees. But man, if I've got 5-degree improvements every single week, almost every skill becomes attainable in weeks. And of course, progress isn't linear. I'm not saying that we always, we need to make this progress in 30 days or something. But what I can, if I get really good at shrinking movements, I'm also good at learning movements. And this process of shrinking movements is a creative one that happens in our mind first. And that's the big word of encouragement. If I could say anything right now and you want to learn an acrobatic skill, I would say start by shrinking the skill in your mind. What's a creative way of doing the skill right now? Literally in your living room. Even if you have a small living room, that sometimes, by the way, it's a constraint. It's not a negative thing. It will actually encourage you to come up with new creative versions. What's a version of the thing that you can do? For a handstand, can you use more support? If more support is easy and you're bored, I can do a handstand with my foot against the wall, but I can't do it without the foot against the wall. Can you do the handstand, but at an angle to the wall? So use a different angle of getting your foot to support you, because what you're used to won't work anymore. And that way, again, just by changing the magnitude of the skill, changing distance, angle, or level of support or height will give you, I think, a lot of benefits of moving you more quicker to your goals within literally one single session. And that's, by the way, the measure that I apply with all my students. I want to have at least one clearly attainable goal that is new every single session. That was a long rant.
Nice.
But it's more my method. It's how I teach.
Yeah. Very, 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 very interesting. Okay, dash. All right. Yeah, I haven't heard that before, so that's very interesting. I would like to ask 3 questions from the community, because we asked people on Instagram what would be their questions, so we definitely have an obligation to go into that also.
Yes, please.
I think. So the first question is, I'm very curious about how you discovered the field of motor learning theory.
I first figured out in my own brain that the body is a complex system and simplified solutions don't really work. So at first I was actually looking up like biomechanics on YouTube or something. And like, there's something here, but it doesn't seem to have all the answers. Then I started looking up textbooks on what used to be called chaos theory, which now is either complexity sciences or dynamical systems theory. And I was like, these guys are making a lot of sense. They're speaking about how the greater the amount of degrees of freedom is, the harder it is to predict any system. And anyone who knows Bernstein, which is a legendary movement researcher, he coined the degrees of freedom problem, essentially saying, how in the world do we make anything happen? We've got so many degrees of freedom throughout our entire body. How do we do anything? Like, you know, the example that I was saying, like draw a straight line in the air. That's a freaking difficult problem if you try to give it for a robot to solve, who's got like 5 different joints and it has to coordinate it. So from there on, though, I then just started to look more like keywords: science motor learning, science movement, science skill, science acrobatics. And I started to look at what are the scientists in the fields are actually saying. And it turns out there's been a massive amount of progress. A lot of the sort of people who are in the professional sports development area, my mentor Rob Gray, he's the skill acquisition specialist for the Boston Red Sox. And he literally is there to judge the practice design. Like, is this a sound way of motor learning? And he's informed by hundreds and thousands of papers that he studied, and I think he published, I don't know, something like 70 papers. And from there, I was just further led into the field. Then there's some easy works, and the one that I recommend is from Robert Gray. It's called How We Learn to Move. He essentially highlights a completely different niche or a different area of skill learning that's not so popular yet. And at the same time, I'm already seeing more and more people picking up on it. It seems to work better. There's like BJJ coaches. It's everywhere now. Like if you see it in professional sports development, practice design has improved a lot. And with the book, How We Learn to Move, you'll get a lot of insight. Another one that you can look up that I recommend is Nick Winkelmann's, I think the book is called Coaching Language. I could be wrong. But Nick Winkelmann and Coaching and Language, you'll find the book. He speaks a lot about how to have good cues that don't disrupt performance, but that help performance. And he's been working together with Gabby Wolf a lot. She's also a researcher. Gabby Wolf, I think Gabriela Wolf and motor learning, and then you'll find tons of her work as well. Studies, but also like proper textbooks. These are sort of key areas that I recommend going into.
Very interesting. Is there someone that looked into acrobatics, or they often use ball sports or something like this, no?
They're individual studies. If you're interested in acrobatics and studies, I recommend following my friend Christos Cornell on Instagram, just because he literally compiles, like he reads so many studies on this. It's so useful. He's my main source of his stories are my main source of looking up relevant studies. And I want to check real quick that, I've got his name right. Christos Cornell, Christos Kornell. So long story short, there is a bunch of studies who've used either gymnasts or Cirque du Soleil artists And those would be the two groups that are looked at the most in terms of scientific research. But of course, it's not that big of a field. And I myself would love to see if I can do some studies on like general population acrobatics. Like, what are all the realistic ways of doing a cartwheel if our expectation is not that we started doing gymnastics when we were 5, but what would a functional cartwheel look like for someone who's 50 who's learning it for the first time? Because there are different versions, and essentially that's where I'd love to do some research on my own. So if, by the way, you're ever interested in that and you were based in Frankfurt, that's super helpful. Please come say hi, because I want to get a bunch of novices and more experienced practitioners to measure their performance when it comes to acrobatics. And in the future, I'm also hoping to do some simple video setups where I can help and just get more data points. So I hope that I'll be one contributor over the coming years.
Nice. Very inspiring. Next question. How did you enter the one-arm handstand field, and what's your experience with your approach?
I totally would say that I haven't entered the one-arm handstand field. I started practicing about a month ago. This question I know comes from one of my followers. We've been chatting online for a while, which is very enjoyable. But essentially, my understanding, and when I kept asking for people, how did they learn the handstand? How did they learn the one-arm handstand? Really common question, or really common reply that I get, and I ask them, what's the best tip that you have for me? The really common reply is, it's about finding the right position, that one right thing, that one right cue. And the other one is, you have to spend a lot of time repeating the same thing over and over again. Basic drills, repeat the basics, always do the basics. Without it, you can't learn. But in my understanding, what the motor science literature is saying is, I want to give my body different experiences of the one key quality. And my aspiration is not to be a professional circus balancer. I just want to have a one-arm handstand for a little bit, and then I might drop it because it's not that interesting a practice. But as I practice more, it becomes more interesting. And here's why. Essentially, instead of trying to find the perfect shape that I can barely hold, or like I try to wobble in position a couple of times, or I do flag drills, which is sort of being in a handstand and then moving the feet from side to side. This is very boring to me. It's actually quite difficult, and it doesn't have a lot in common for me with the one-arm handstand. I want to get a feeling for, what is it like to have all my weight on one shoulder? What do corrections feel like? So here's what I do a lot. I simply place myself against a wall in many different angles so that I use one fingertip support and one toe tip support. And when I remove that one toe, suddenly rotation starts to happen. And when I start to use that one finger, rotation starts to happen. And then I do all sorts of different shapes. Strato, half stag, what they're all called, like half pike, odd shapes, like weird things. I'll even start flagging. Essentially, I want to give my body as much explorative experience as I can so that it can figure out this is the commonality between all. And there's a sort of a little thing that for me is really important. I want to have as much weight on one hand as possible. So for me, I don't do my 10-second fingertip holds where like I'm on 5 fingertips for one side, or like that I keep going in and out of the position. Because for me, that's a separate skill as well. Kicking into handstand, shifting the weight over is one skill, and then balancing it is another skill. For now, I'm interested in the balancing skill. So for me, that means I waste zero energy trying to get into the position because I use the wall with a lot of support. But then what I've come to quite reliably after 30 days of practice is I can pretty consistently hold a 10-second one fingertip support on my right side and a sort of more consistent 5-second hold, one fingertip support on the other side. The big takeaway though that I'd love to share here is that I don't know if this is the most efficient way of learning the one-arm handstand. I don't know anyone who's taught it this way before, and it's quite frankly also not my goal. But what a friend of mine, Jeremy Fine, also on Instagram, great movement coach, you can look him up, Jeremy Fine, highly recommend his channel and his newsletter. When I told him like I'm doing this one-arm journey and asked him, what about you? Have you tried it? He's like, I tried it before, but I decided I didn't want to try it if it meant suffering. He's like, I don't want to suffer to learn the one-arm handstand. And that's my approach too. So all I'm doing is spending about 5 minutes per day playing around with a challenge that is at the optimal challenge point, which means if I can successfully do the thing that I'm set out to do about 60 to 85% of the time, the optimal challenge point is usually defined as like 85% success rate, then I know I'm doing a good job. So that's all that I'm looking for. How can I have fun right now with a one-arm handstand type challenge that I can succeed at? And then, one last thing that I also do is I practice on hard ground, on soft ground, on a parallel bar, at a slight incline, at a decline. So I'll use lots of different surfaces because I believe that my body, at least according to what people like Rob Gray are finding in their research, will learn better by scoping out the space and finding the commonality that all one-arm balances have in common.
Will you share more about this on Instagram, about your path? I think it will be interesting at least for me. I would definitely follow your post on that because it is a topic that I've looked at recently also at opening up the handstand practice more. I've talked with one student of mine who's also very interested in that. And I have also the assumption that it can work, but the data is not there yet.
Yeah. Actually, thank you for asking about it, because for me, what I am doing is recording a YouTube video for it. So I've got sort of the starting point and then all the midway points and then little wins, and I've got my little training notebook. So I want to do a longer term YouTube video on it. But now that you mentioned like there would be an interest, I might be doing more on Instagram. But honestly, this is an area in my life that I haven't figured out that well yet. I want to share a lot more content, but I also love teaching and creating courses and so on and so forth. So right now, I'm still doing everything myself, which is a joy, but also a burden. So in that regard, I'm going to give an open, I want to do it. I don't know if I'll get to it, but thank you for asking. And at least in my stories, every now and then I'll share like a different little task. For example, I actually don't know if I shared this yet, but I've tried a handstand before, one-arm handstand, and then use a ring, a gymnastic ring, to give me some support. And of course it does help. But it doesn't help nearly as much as having anything stable there. And I have no clue how successful that single instance of a skill is. But I think with like this kind of exploration, I feel like I'm making good progress. I'm probably going to check in, like I've got a little mark. I think today is 31st day from when I started, but I think I've had like 25 practice sessions. So I didn't do it every day either. And I usually stick to no more than 10 minutes. Most of the time it's like a quick session because I forgot about it and still want to get some reps in. So it would be interesting, like one-arm handstands without the suffering, coined by Jeremy Fine. That would be the goal.
Last question. I have to translate it. I read first in German, and then I translate. Wie bleibst du in frustrierenden Trainingsmomenten oder stressigen Phasen freundlich und positiv zu dir? So, how do you stay in frustrating moments of training or stressful phases friendly and positive to yourself?
It's wonderful how the question is worded because it implies that I can share from my own experience. And that's exactly where I'd say I'm not sure how much of my experience will be applying to other people. But how to put this? I just love my practice so much. And over the course of like 15 years of self-directed learning, which is right, I started with parkour. Of course, there were some peers around, but essentially it was more or less a solo practice the whole time. Of course, there's people around, but then especially over the last 7 years, I think 99.5% of my practice sessions are by myself. So the result of those accumulation of those years is just that when I allow frustration to happen, I don't want to return back to practice tomorrow. And if I feel like I'm angry with myself, then I feel like I haven't understood my task of longevity well enough. Now, if you're asking, like, how do I get there in terms of what are the advice or the recommendations that I give? To me, the key point in learning anything well is creativity. Because it might happen, and for me, it does happen all the freaking time, that I do a skill, I have something in mind, and I get stuck. It's a one-way street, and there's a traffic jam ahead, and I'm like, this doesn't feel like I don't want to do this. That's when I allow myself the freedom to openly explore the landscape. I never have to compete in one-arm handstands. That's never going to be on my agenda. I never have to perform a backflip to catch myself in a handstand if I don't want to. Like maybe one day I will want to, and that would be that thing. But essentially, by saying this is for me. This is my practice. This is not for anyone else. This is just for me. That gives me all the freedom in the world to say, oh, I can always take a left turn when I want to. I can always return. And then, in my experience, most of my students are not competitive either. Like there's been a circus performer, and of course, one that was interesting, he's still working on getting his backflip to do during a partner acro performance. Would be awesome. I think the macaco right now is already in, so that's cool. But most people are like physiotherapists or other movement teachers, and they know it's kind of cool, but no one will ask of them to do the skill. So the freedom many of us experience. But the question is, this is, if I continue the metaphor, if I'm driving in a one-way street and there's a traffic jam ahead, it tends to be that our windshield and the glasses of the vehicle we're driving in, they're clouded. I know I can, in theory, turn. No one is forcing me to stay in this lane, but I can't see yet. What are the other options? And that's where I would say creativity comes in, and simply thinking up ways of what are different things that I can do here. Because the dash acronym, for example, but it's also about being creative in measuring progress. So for example, every single time that I've done my backflip to handstand practice, because it's just one of the recent skills that I've been doing, every single session I found a way to measuring direct progress. Here's what I mean. The first time I did it, I could barely catch myself. Like I did 70 reps. I had all of them on video, and I can already do a push-up, handstand push-up. So I caught myself and almost sort of scrambled to the floor and barely made myself to push up, but I did catch one, sort of. Good enough. If, by the way, that hadn't been possible, I would have simply looked for what is the amount of time that I stand in my hands before my feet touch the ground. I would have a PR. By definition, I've never done this skill before, so it must be a PR. And then they'll be like, oh, I'm actually in the air on my hands for 28 frames. So then I did the skill again. The next time I practiced it, I landed it, the first one in a session after 30 repetitions. I was like, awesome, progress. The next time I did it 2 weeks later, I landed my first catch to handstand after 23 reps. Then, after that, I did it for the first time ever outside on grass. I didn't catch a single one. Was I frustrated? I was like, no, this was the first time I've ever done this skill outside. And here's the silly thing. When I did it indoors, I did it on soft yoga mats, so the soft grass was probably softer. But I knew the environment is different. It is a first. And then when I did it yesterday, I caught myself in a handstand after 2 reps. And that's a massive success. But I don't grade myself on, how to put this? I don't listen to the measures where I've regressed. I always look for what are the measures where I have progressed. If I can't find a measure, it means I haven't been creative enough. It doesn't mean I haven't learned. It means I haven't looked for the right space where I have learned, because that's the inevitable law pretty much of motor learning. There is going to be a version of progress that happens. And here's the caveat. If I'm sick and I'm not feeling it, but I still decided to go in a session, and I might struggle to find any measure that I've improved at, then what I did do for the first time is practice the skill when I'm sick. And I don't want to push that aside. I can then say, I think this built like a better resilience in my practice. And I don't encourage people to go, do acrobatics when they're sick. Probably a bad idea. But I'm saying even when there's like dire circumstances, there is likely a part where I can look, where I can tap myself on the shoulder and say, you did a good job. So I just learned how to do that in an acrobatic environment. Do I have that for the rest of my life all the time? No, for sure not. But I hope I'm slowly improving in all the right directions.
Nice. Thank you very much, Aaron. Let's come to a conclusion of this podcast. So what I took out of our talk is there's a lot of interesting stuff in the theory of motor learning, which, if I understood correctly, is a relatively fresh field. So it will be probably interesting what's going to happen there in the next 10, 20 years. And I've seen this approach that you are following also come up in different fields. Like you said, like there's in BJJ, people that are doing this. There is work like from Josef Fuček from Fighting Monkey, who's also approaching motor learning for a long time, working with constraints. And in that sense, that was always very interesting about his approach, or the approach of him and Linda, because I think back then, like when I first time did their stuff, that felt something very new, and now it's like almost, how can you say, like a thing that universally pops up at the moment in different words. And I think that's very, very interesting. Then we had the DASH acronym, distance, angle, level of support, and height. And also your general approach, we learned about your general mindset to practicing, which is about keeping a positive relationship with the practice and with learning. And if I understand correctly, a joyful relationship, because that will help you to play the long game.
Especially that last part was so wonderfully put.
Aaron?
If you're asking me, having looked at the last, like this nice overview that you showed us, I probably next time would ask of myself to spend more time on the joyful part, because I think that's the one that tends to be underemphasized when it comes to motor learning, fitness, being in the body. And for some people, diet plays into this, and there's this course of sense and nature. And that's where I want to give a mini shout out to probably my biggest inspiration in the scientific and sense-making community at the moment, which is David Deutsch, an author who wrote 2 phenomenal books, David Deutsch, Beginning of Infinity and The Fabric of Reality. Naval Ravikant, if anyone knows Naval, he says he read the books and he literally felt smarter. And Naval himself is a very smart guy, and he keeps carrying one copy of the book wherever he goes. So David Deutsch has this idea of interest, or he called it actually the fun criterion, that having fun doing an activity is a way of having good solutions for the problems we're trying to solve. And if we're not having fun, it means we're currently lacking the knowledge that would make it fun, but it's not more or less than that. It's not required to suffer. That's the idea. It is also true that, according to his philosophy, taken from Karl Popper in part, that suffering is inevitable. And I think everyone can sort of sense that that seems to be one of the truths, the fundamental principles. But problems are inevitable. But the suffering component can be alleviated with the right kind of knowledge. And that's where I find a lot of the magic for me started happening when I was looking through this lens of, I just stopped telling myself that I'm not good enough to do something. I started looking for what's the knowledge that I'm missing that would allow me to do this either more successfully or more joyfully, joyful. That's the big part. So thank you so much for highlighting this at a sort of the closing point of this conversation. If I would give anyone the idea, like, for how to approach acrobatics, then I would say joyfully. And if there's struggle, which there will naturally be, then I would say that means we're missing a little bit of the entrance point. But the joy of the practice, it's something that makes me be so certain that movement is going to stay a part of my life, because it's one of the parts where I get the most reliable joy from whenever I practice. And for me, by now, that's true for strength and flexibility training, for acrobatic practice, for picking up new skills, for fooling around with a skill like the one-arm handstand that I don't have any utility for other than saying, can I do it without suffering? So that would be, I think, the closing words that I would love to leave this with.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. Let's have a quick look into what's the best place for people to find you. Soft Acro Aaron is Aaron's handle on Instagram. And that's also your webpage, softacroaaron.com.
That's it.
And you have a YouTube account as well. So if I put Aaron Martin into YouTube,
actually, it will still be Soft Acro Aaron. It's the downside of having a very international sounding name, because Aaron Martins are plenty.
Yeah, because there is some other stuff coming up if I put
like rugby players Martin, and stuff.
If I put Aaron.
I think there's a Formula 1 racer. Right.
Okay,
so Soft Acro Aaron.
Put Aaron Martin, Soft Acrobatics. Yeah, Soft Acro Aaron. Okay. And if people want to see what you did 10 years ago or 12 years ago, they can put into YouTube Aaron Martin parkour, and they can watch some of your old parkour videos, because this is what I did in the preparation of this podcast. I looked at the old Ashigaru videos of you, and it's very, very impressive, especially for the listener. If you remember how Aaron said that in the beginning, like, he came from soccer and he thought, wow, this acrobatics is that's far from me and impressive. But then when you see the videos, it looks so natural. Yeah, like you see the videos and it looks like he must be born with these skills. So it's even more like it puts things into a great perspective for this whole podcast, seeing how Aaron in the first thought of himself and then developed himself in this field of parkour and has now continued into soft acrobatics. I feel you definitely have like experienced your own message in that sense.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. Well, first, thank you so much for bringing us together, for being a very generous host, and for being really a thought leader in this whole movement conversation. It's also so clear how much time you spend on thinking about the problems that come up when we're thinking about movement and the movement culture and the practice around it, and what are good ways to think about those. I think that's super, super helpful and super important. And for myself, I'm interested in teaching adult acrobatics because I know what it feels like to not have any avenues to start. To be like, I don't even know how I could get started. For the longest, I was always the kid, at a playground, for sure, I would try to climb up something, but I would never dare to do something like a somersault. I'm glad, probably, I don't know what would have happened. But that was just completely out of my realm of what's possible until I realized that there's other lunatic teenagers who are also teaching. They've thrown themselves, they've done the step before me, so that I knew like, okay, maybe I can get started, to then finding myself being hurt and seeing like this doesn't hold up. Maybe the foundation is important, to then finding out there's plenty of people by now, like one of my students, as well, Philip, he taught himself how to do a back handspring at, I'm not sure, he's like 25-ish now, 26, I'm not sure, but also no acrobatic background practice. And he keeps teaching himself these amazing acro flows where I'm actually competing with him in some aspects. I'm like, he's doing a new skill, he's like showing me his new video. I'm like, damn, he can do that. And he's been practicing for like a year and a half now. It's not been that long. So it's cool to see what's possible.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you very much for being here, Aaron. And this will not be our last time we spoke on this podcast. So the audience can already look forward to another episode in the future.
Thank you so much, Josef. It's been a joy.